Well, the first statement is, of course, the importance of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights from 2011. All businesses shall follow the management standard, do assessments on own operations, and require the same from their business relationships. And they shall be able to share those assessments with not only the impacted stakeholders, but also their business relationships. Hence, the standard creates the basis for transparency in business relationships. I should be able to see, my company should be able to see your company's impact assessments in alignment with the guiding principles.
But companies are not geared to be transparent. Raw materials go in at one end and products come out at the other. So two things. First, if a company does not choose to be transparent about forced labor, how do you know what's going on in their factories?
You are supposed to be able to demonstrate that you did assessment against all human rights. And of course, that includes also the right not to be subjected to forced labor, next to the other human rights. And you should be able to demonstrate that risk assessment with your business relationships. If you then tell your business relationships that you do not have risks on the prohibition of forced labor, then you should be able to explain to them why you think you have no risk. And that better be a reasonable explanation, especially if you operate in areas in the world where we know that, or in sectors where we know that forced labor has occurred. So that was, so to say, well, you may choose not to be transparent about it, not to share your impact assessments. And then it's increased risk for me as a buyer. If I can't see those impact assessments, I know that you are not diligently managing your risks on impacts on human rights. Would I then dare continue collaboration with you, or would I choose another supplier that can supply the same product, but has chosen to, of course, follow the minimum standard for responsible business conduct? And this is not a so to say, a good practice or expected practice. It is actually the minimum standard. It's the bare minimum you're supposed to do. So I think also Professor John Rocky, when he prepared the guiding principles, were well aware that the bar in relation to responsible business conduct was heightened considerably with the standard. But yet it's a common standard, and we are all supposed to do it, and it's a global standard. It's UN mandated. Hence, we could expect it from any business anywhere in the world.
If they say that they are not responsible for any forced labor in raw materials, because so many sectors, the factory is the processing. But if you look at rice or mica or palm oil, that's a feedstock that's coming in. And yet some companies in the processing portion are being held responsible for deforestation, which is happening at the feedstock level. So how do you as a company defend your position under law?
So it's not a defensible position to say that we are not responsible for those impacts that would occur somewhere in the value chain. You are responsible for impacts in your full value chain, both upstream and downstream. In order to do that, I have to go back to the basis. I did my own due diligence for my own operations. I can demonstrate that by my regular operational level impact assessments. And I did raise the requirement to my business relationships, which is the minimum by the standard, that they should meet the standard and do it themselves. If they do that, they would have pushed that requirement to the next level of the value chain. We are supposed to use our leverage to make the impact stop and not reoccur. Hence, we would go to that entity in the value chain, ask them to stop the impact. Whether you're liable or not is another question. One way to come out of any future liability in those situations would be to do your due diligence. Did you do enough? And that has yet to be established moving forward now that we are seeing regulation coming in place, requiring companies to implement the UN guiding principles.
That distinction between responsibility and liability is key. So you are responsible to know what is going on and to take whatever action you can to the extent of leverage that you have. And you cannot simply turn a blind eye to what you know is happening. And if you don't know, then you need to know. You need to encourage your business relationships to make the right choice so that they do not create a risk and a liability for you. And if not, you have to make some hard decisions as a company to say, should I continue a relationship with this supplier who is obviously quite recalcitrant, does not wish to do a due diligence, and does not wish to give me the information that allows me to continue to do business with them.
Correct. But mind you, the guiding principles are very explicit. John Ruggie was very explicit in his articles around this. He wrote a piece to the OECD on responsibility in supply chains. He's very clear that by the end of the day, you may be in a position where you have to continue a business relationship, even though they have demonstrated severe impacts on human rights and they refuse to implement due diligence themselves. So John Ruggie is pragmatic in his approach. You are not supposed to do the due diligence for your business relationships, but you have to require them to do their due diligence. When an incident occurs, it demonstrates to you that they did not do proper due diligence because they didn't prevent or mitigate that impact from occurring.
Which leads us to your second statement.
One have to be aware that the guiding principles do require regular operational level human rights impact assessments in all businesses, no matter what their size are and where they operate, and in their subsidiaries. So we all need to create that level of transparency for our own company and our own company group. And then we have to require the same from our business relationships. Hence, this is the ability, that's what the guiding principles wanted to create, the ability to scale up respect for human rights as a minimum standard. We all need to have this management system where we manage human dignity in place for our companies. It's not it's only companies in emerging economies that need to do this. It's all businesses. We have by far not reached that level yet. I've seen very few companies actually that covered all their own operations and their subsidiaries.
But there is, the individual company, and then there is the sector as a whole. So unless, you are dominant in that sector and can actually make the rules by which everyone else is going to follow, you actually need the participation of a lot of people, all of your peers, everybody moving ultimately or wanting to move into the same direction. So the question remains, what if everybody ultimately, doesn't, or let's say you have a situation where you have one holdout and it's that lowest common denominator in the industry association that keeps the standard at the most recalcitrant. And we've seen this happen. Sometimes we look at some voluntary standards now that still persist, or the levels of certification that persist, and when we read the fine print, it's almost in defiance of logic that something like this can still persist. So how can we move what may remain as a voluntary standard of good practice, albeit informed, by the UNGPs? How can we move this nice-to-have suggestion to be made mandatory?
International law is very slow in implementation. It can take decades for international law to be implemented by national laws all over. The guiding principles is this smart mix. Pillar 1, the state's duty to protect human rights. It's explicit in Pillar 1 that states are obligated to regulate businesses within their territory to respect human rights, i.e. to implement the management system that was described in Pillar 2. So John Ruggie foresaw, and bless his soul, unfortunately he died last year, being an international lawyer and having followed international law and implementation of international law over decades, I will say that the mere fact that we now experience 10 years later that states here under the EU Commission, so it's several states, are now making human rights due diligence mandatory is actually quite fast in international law understanding. Now, so I will not call the guiding principles a voluntary standard. They are binding interpretation of existing hard law for states. The UN cannot regulate businesses directly. They can only regulate states. And they now ask states to regulate businesses within their jurisdiction. And we're with the draft directive of corporate sustainability due diligence from the EU, we are now seeing that the EU region is one of the first regions to move ahead on this, but we've seen similar approaches coming up other places in Latin America, in Japan and other places. So we will see regulation appear where companies are mandated to follow the minimum standard for responsible business conduct, i.e. do their human rights due diligence, implement the management system. So is that needed? Now we have the standard, so why don't business follow it? And but having worked with business for 30 years now, I know that there's definitely a difference between being aware that this is a standard that will be possibly made mandatory at some point in the future, and then seeing the writing on the wall, namely the draft law being processed in the regulatory regimes. So right now, at this moment where we speak, we are seeing a drastic rise in implementation of the UN guiding principles with businesses and investors all over, particularly in Europe, but all over the world. So
this is coming hot on the heels of, as you say, the EU having put in place the CS3D, the corporate sustainability due diligence. And then when national law speaks to their businesses, they will have to codify this in a form of compliance in terms of reporting, in terms of general evidence of certain practices and procedures being followed, which would be a management system. And on that, what's your third point?
The whole key to this system is, of course, that we need to share an understanding of what is then the minimum documentation that we can expect from due diligence. So if I claim that I do my human rights due diligence because I had an issue or something, what would I need to demonstrate to the stakeholders that would, so to say, criticize what I'm doing? And I think that will be, so to say, the key to the implementation. Now in the future, we'll have supervisory bodies in all EU states. And there will be a EU Commission overall supervisory body where they can all refer into and get clarification on the understanding of the directive. And the first thing they have to consider before giving fines that actually relate to the turnover of the companies to companies because they don't do their due diligence is, how do they document due diligence? When can we be satisfied as a supervisory body that the company in question actually has a management system as depicted by the guiding principles and hence do their due diligence? How can they document that they do their due diligence? That would be the so to say the first point to clarify moving forward. The investors are already doing it. We already have law in the EU through the EU regulation on sustainable investment that passed in 2020 and became law 1st January this year. So actually now, in order to claim that investment is sustainable, there are 3 requirements. The two first has to do with environmental impacts. The third, the minimum safeguards, has to be implemented by the company that wish to claim that they are creating a sustainable investment. And that requires that the UN guiding principles, OSD guidelines, are implemented. The management system is implemented. So already now we have supervisory bodies on the financial sector manning up on their understanding on the guiding principles so that they can review a company's actions to see if it actually qualifies as sustainable investment.
And the fallout from that particular law, we've already seen, for example, manifest in certification, labeling standards on garments in Europe. We've seen, actually, I feel also the testing of what was perhaps, a little more of a motherhood ESG claim. Now people are really coming down to, so what is this ESG all about? And being in the discourse, you can really see how these dots are connecting. A law comes into place, and suddenly clothes in Norway are being scrutinized. Suddenly, overseas investment and pension funds are asking, well, what does ESG actually mean? We've been following these standards, but now we look at the numbers and we're saying things are not really adding up.
Yeah, so we have seen thousands of voluntary initiatives that were there before the guiding principles, and most of them, and even some created after the guiding principles, that wish to somehow align with the terminology in the guiding principles and use terminology like due diligence and similar. However, I see very, very few that are actually one-to-one aligned with the minimum standard. So that's one issue you have to be aware of. And the guiding principles are very clear that whenever you have to do with human rights or labor rights, you need to align with the guiding principles. And they don't. Hence, it is needed that we get this common understanding on how do we actually document due diligence as a company, so that we can document it towards our suppliers and basically assist them do their due diligence, because we will share the results from our own due diligence, which consists of assessment against all rights, not only labor rights or forced labor, describing the actions to prevent and mitigate those risks that you identified, indicators of effectiveness on your actions to prevent and mitigate. And these are not key performance indicators that run your company. These are concrete operational level indicators demonstrating that those risks that you identified are managed well. You have to depict who's the person responsible in the company to manage that risk. And finally, you have to also be transparent about the resources that were allocated to the actions to prevent and mitigate. And finally, of course, all this needs to be done in engagement with the impacted stakeholders. So they need to be taken into the due diligence process. So the standard, the guiding principles, if you read that literally, word by word, it's actually very well described what you need to do. However, we see quite very few initiatives or even certifications of all kinds that one-to-one can measure up to the bare minimum. Hence, it may be a false security that if you follow some of these initiatives, it may give you a false security that you actually meet the standard.
So the challenge is that I'm a concerned consumer in Europe. I just buy the products, or I'm a retail shareholder. I'm not a fund manager. I have a pension fund. I buy unit trust, and there are certain claims, that are made either by the product that I see on the shelf because it has a certification that says deforestation free, slave free, and then we have a pension fund that says that this is we only invest in sustainable projects, in projects that do not exploit, etc., etc. But I look at the companies and the portfolio in this basket of equity, and there are companies operating supply chains from Asia, and I've heard and I've read that, there's all sorts of problems in Asia. So, it's huge sweeping generalizations, because as a consumer, what do I know? I only read the newspapers. I only have, investments in savings accounts. So what protects me as a shareholder, a retail shareholder, or a concerned consumer, what protects me from being complicit in these actions if I buy their products or I earn unjust enrichment dividends because their share price goes up? Am I part of the problem if I do not make an effort to know?
Of course, I mean, we are all part of the problems that we've seen so far, and that will continue to exist for quite a while. The intention with the guiding principles is, of course, that those problems will minimize over time. So as a consumer or as a private investor, you should, of course, expect from those taking care of your investments and from the companies that you buy from, that they meet the minimum standard. And then, of course, you have to, as a consumer, inform yourself that try to get rid of your own biases. I mean, a Chinese company may as well respect human rights as any European company. So don't put in decades of prejudice to your understanding of what is dangerous or not dangerous to invest in. So of course we should all be able to meet this level playing field, and European and American companies should also work on their so to say historic and understandable prejudice that the challenges are not occurring in our part of the world, but other parts of the world, which is not true. It's happening everywhere. We have forced labor in Europe, plenty of forced labor. We have forced labor in the US, but we also have a range of other human rights impacts everywhere. And all businesses need to manage those and be transparent about how they manage that. And then look up your country record to find out where you may have particular risks as a company. I mean, if a Danish company doing the impact assessment, they just have to go to the 4-year review by the UN of the human rights situation in Denmark to find that we have a huge issue of discrimination primarily based on ethnicity, people with disabilities, gender discrimination. So all states have their challenges, and the businesses operating in those states will live within those understandings that we don't have a challenge. We also states want to claim that they don't have challenges. But this is distinct from what the states do. Businesses need to manage those risks, and they can do it. But it does require that you become more aware. And that's what the management system will enable in any company anywhere in the world.